Hi, I'm Dr. Gwen. I'm a clinical psychologist who's been empowering disabled individuals, their families, and their support systems for over 20 years. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel, where I curate tools, share mindsets, and promote habits to help the neurodiverse community thrive. Also, hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. In this episode, I interview Grace Myhill, a relationship coach and the director of AANE's Peter M. Friedman Neurodiverse Couples Institute. She specializes in supporting and empowering neurodiverse couples. Grace shares her approach to couples counseling and how it's different from traditional couples therapy. We debunk myths, and Grace shares practical tools and strategies to improve relationship skills. We also explore the fundamental assumption that people have good intentions and how important neutral curiosity and perspective taking is in any relationship. Grace has trained couples therapists from all over the world to empower and support neurodiverse couples. I'm so grateful for her generosity of time today. I hope you enjoy this interview with Grace. Hi, Grace. Welcome to the channel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much for being here. I wonder if we could start by you telling us about yourself.
Sure. I was trained originally as a clinical social worker, and I started working with AANE almost 20 years ago. At first, I was helping with some groups for adults on the spectrum, and then spouses kept calling and asking, "What do you have for us?" So they asked me to do a group for spouses. And then after a while of doing that, the spouses were asking if they could bring in their partners. So I started doing groups for couples. And then we had grandparents calling, so I started doing some groups for them, and then siblings, adult siblings of people on the spectrum. So, over the last 2 decades, AANE has grown incredibly in terms of what they offer to everyone in the community and the family of someone on the spectrum. But personally, what I started to do was to have a private practice where I started to see couples either together or separately. And so I've since then become the director of Couples and Partner Services at AANE and the director of their Neurodiverse Couples Institute, which is a program that we launched a few years ago to make an online training program to teach therapists how to work differently with neurodiverse couples.
Yeah, and for the audience, some people may not know what organization AANE is. I'm wondering if you can just, expand on that just a little bit more.
Sure. So it stands for the Asperger's Autism Network, and it physically is in Watertown, Massachusetts. It started many, many, many years ago with really parents of kids on the spectrum and some professionals who were working in that area. And it's just grown and grown and grown. And in this past pandemic year, every single one of their programs has become online. And so it's really been a huge worldwide resource. Everyone who does groups will report, in our weekly staff meetings, oh, we had someone from Australia. Oh, this week we had someone from India. We had someone from Asia. It's just from everywhere because there aren't enough resources for people on spectrum and their families. And so AANE is really filling a much needed void, and we're seeing how needed that and how big that void is with the number of people that are coming in daily to our whether they contact us by phone or by email. We're just really being flooded with responses and questions, and people who just want more information. So the pandemic has really changed things for AANE, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank goodness you were there, and I'll leave the information in the description below as well so that people can find that link and the spelling and everything of that. And, I feel like what was so exciting for me when I found out about you, when I discovered you through a colleague, is that there not only are the resources for adults on the spectrum quite minimal, I think. the support for couples is even less.
Yes.
So and that work is inherently different for lots of reasons, but I wonder if we can get into that and how you feel it's different. How is couples therapy different when there's one partner who is neurodiverse or neurodivergent, in the couple?
Right. So a lot of couples that come to me for couples coaching, that's what I do now. I do neurodiverse couples coaching. They have been to 5 or 6 or even more couples therapists before me, and they feel that they were not understood. Either one or both of them felt blamed or sometimes inadvertently shamed. They were not given concrete tools and strategies. And so that is really, I think, those two things are the major differences: wanting concrete tools and strategies and wanting to be understood by the therapist. And I think that unless you have given the knowledge and then have the experience of working with neurodiverse couples, it's very hard to really understand the experience that both partners in the relationship go through. And if you
Mm-hmm.
think about it, if a person has an Asperger's trait, let's just pick one. Let's say communication. Let's say they have some difficulty with communication. In an intimate relationship, that is pervasive. That is every time there's a conversation or even a comment made, there's the opportunity for a disconnection as much as an opportunity for a connection with a couple. And so a lot of the work I do is teaching real concrete tools and strategies. Often a couple will say they went to previous therapists who said, go home and spend more time talking to each other, or go home and be empathic to your partner, go home and be more supportive. But, that leaves the person on the spectrum not really understanding how to do that. And the therapist not really understanding that the person on the spectrum doesn't really understand how to do that. Not only just do that in general, but do that in the way that their particular partner wants. Their particular partner may think it's obvious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody thinks that the way they think is the way everybody thinks. And so I think what really is lacking is an awareness of the vast differences in the way the different partners communicate and experience the world. And the therapist really needs to become bilingual and needs to be able to interpret for both people in the relationship. For example, to even explain, okay, one person in this relationship may be trying to communicate to exchange information, but the other person in this relationship may be trying to communicate to connect. And so if every time they're trying to connect, it's being viewed as just an exchange of information, that connection isn't going to be felt. But if the person is told, okay, these other ways of communicating would feel more connecting, okay, let's try that. So a lot of the couples I see, they're very willing and eager to learn the techniques to have the relationship improve. They just haven't been taught how before.
Yeah, and I love this idea of bilingualism, because there is an interpretation, and it goes back to what you said, wanting to be understood, and how important that is for all of us, but especially when I might have some difficulty communicating in the first place. That's already a challenge to me, let's just say. But to be able to really close this gap, if you will, and to close it with concrete skills that you're sending people home with. And I can understand that when you said, go home and try to be more empathic. I was like, oh my goodness, like that's not going to work, to be able to say, this is what that means. This is what it means to your partner. And this is the behavior that matches that. That's what you
Right.
go home and you practice.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So feeling misunderstood. It really broke my heart when you said, I've heard this multiple times, even in individual therapy, being an individual therapist, which is I've tried multiple therapists
Mm-hmm.
and I left feeling more misunderstood and then shame, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
so hard when really the work, you expect that place to not, where shame should not exist. And that's
Totally.
so hard. The work is so hard as it is. So
Yes.
to experience that over and over again, it's
Yeah.
hard. Really, really
Yes.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Grace, when you think about what some of your most effective ways of empowering your couples with skills, what are some of your most effective tools that wow, like, this really does work? What would some of those be in the couples work?
So one of the basic tools is right behind me in that picture on the wall. It is a duck bunny. It is a duck in one direction and a bunny in the other direction. And I use this to start out with a couple to help them understand that there are two equally valid perspectives in their relationship, that each of them sees something through their own brain, their own experiences, their own perspective, and to not use language that makes it seem like they own the one reality. For example, that's not actually what happened. Let me tell you how it was. Or, no, you didn't say that. This is what our conversation was like. Lots of couples say things like this because honestly, they believe that that's what happened. No one's intentionally trying to hurt their partner's feelings, but the effect is to really shut down their partner who has a very different way of perceiving the world. And it makes sense. If you look at the neurology, it makes sense that they would have all these differences. Like if one person is looking at the details and then connecting the details to make a big picture, but the other person is looking at the big picture and then honing in on the details, they're going to experience different things. One person's going to miss some details, the other person's going to miss how some of these details are connected or what the bigger picture, a general idea is. And if you think about communication, if one person is focusing on the specific word choice and a literal interpretation, and the other person is talking in some maybe vague generalities or bringing in a context that is implied, not
Mm-hmm.
explicitly stated, they're going to have a different experience of the conversation or the experience. So a lot of my work is some psychoeducation around the different neurologies to take away the blame. It's nobody's fault. Everybody assumes good intentions. That's where we should start. Let's
Yes.
start by getting people to assume good intentions and to really understand that everybody has their own valid perception. And let's talk about how to ask about it. How about some phrases like, this is how I think about it. How do you think about it? This is what I think went down. What did you think went down? So there's often not that back and forth. There's often not that neutral curiosity. That's what I call it. People
Mm.
tend to get very entrenched into their own way of seeing something and can get quite defensive about it until they realize that their partner's not intentionally resisting their ideas. They just honestly don't see them. And so there has to be a lot of extra work done to help bridge those gaps. And that's where a therapist who knows how to do this work can really step in and be an interpreter for both people.
Yeah, it's this dual role of interpretation and teaching, because, and I think that's
Mhm.
so great to start off with this idea to assume good intentions. That is such I think a critical assumption to make in the work that we do anyway, which is the good intentions are there. What's missing are the skills to fill the gap in order to make that happen. And I think even in family work or couples work, I'm sure, the goal of the couple is the same. They want the intimacy. They want to experience the connection. But how do we get there? And I think the other piece that comes to my mind is how a lot of times executive functioning plays a role in communicating with others. the idea of how do I identify the path to get to that goal and then to check myself along the way. That's really hard. And that's where I think a loving and expert hand comes into play for that guidance, which is great. That neutral curiosity, it's so funny. The idea of scripts, early on in my career, we were like, no, like stop the scripting. Don't let the scripting happen. And what I've come to realize is scripts are really nice when we don't know what to say. So I love,
Yes.
like what you were saying, like, I thought, I was thinking that. So how did that go down for you?
Yeah.
Just empowering people with scripts, even like, how do you confront somebody in a way that's non-threatening?
Right.
Having a script in that moment is so
Yes.
helpful, or just even I think the other thing, and maybe you can talk to this, is sometimes having some rules.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do you have like helpful rules that you use with couples to help guide them?
Yes. There are some couples that need to make their own rules around the language that they use, whether there's no name calling or no interruptions, or even how to handle the lack of follow through. Like sometimes that's a big source of stress in a relationship. So that the person who says it's not a good time has to come back within 24 hours and say when it would be a good time, or else the other partner's just left hanging or becoming a nag to have to chase. So sometimes there's rules like that. But what I usually do with couples is I start them out with a simple dialoguing tool called question, answer, 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 and or QAAA, or you could name it whatever you want. Some people call it Q3A or whatever. But it's really to teach how to have a back and forth. And again, this is something that a lot of couples haven't been taught how to do. There's usually one person who maybe asks questions, but the other person often doesn't ask questions, or they ask informational questions, not connecting questions, or they, I don't know. It's something that gets off balance very, very easily in a relationship. So the idea of the question, answer, answer, answer is that they would make a rule to spend 10 minutes a day having a back and forth where one person asks a question, the other person answers in exactly 3 sentences. That's the answer, answer, answer part. And then they ask a question back, and the other person answers in exactly 3 sentences. And there's no interruption, there's no criticism, and there's no defensiveness. And so even just setting up this as a rule, we're going to meet at 8 o'clock at night on the couch, and we're just going to do this. So no one has to initiate it. Everyone's responsible for getting themselves there. So for folks with executive function challenges, they may need to put an alert in their phone or sticky note on the bathroom mirror or whatever it takes to get themselves there. And that becomes a routine after a
Yeah.
while. And it becomes something that they can look forward to because it's their time when they're going to be focused on each other. They can ask questions that they really want answers to. And no one's rushing out the door. No one's busy thinking about work. It's some sort of relationship time. And a lot of times couples don't realize that, or maybe one partner might not realize that relationships need time each day to, stay nurtured and healthy. And so it just becomes they could do that time anytime that works for them. Some people prefer it in the morning, some people prefer it at lunch or by phone or by text. And even if you can't eke out 10 minutes because you have kids and busy lives, then start with one question each. I always try to meet people where they are. If we could only get one question each, great, we'll start there and then we'll build on it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's what we pay attention to that becomes important for us, right? So this idea of really making it a priority, because it does take some work. I mean, having a relationship does take some work and attention in order to nurture connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Grace, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that even this exercise, it may sound simple, but it's actually quite hard because for people who tend to talk with a lot of words, condensing their message down to 3 sentences is, is some effort, but it helps the other person to be able to comprehend what's being said. There aren't too many words thrown at them, so they, get confused about what's the important thing here. What am I supposed to respond to? What am I not. So, and for other people where their natural tendency is to give a one-word answer, they don't realize that just shuts the communication down. So when they have to dig deep to come up with 3 sentences worth, even when they think it's a yes or no question or a one-word answer, then that helps diminish the possibilities of miscommunication because they're
Mhm.
getting more out of their head and they're saying it. So then there's fewer voids left for assumptions and miscommunication.
Right, because we would naturally fill in we naturally fill in the gaps in our minds. And
Right.
so it's much better when it comes from the other person.
Yeah.
Grace, you had mentioned the difference between informational versus connection questions.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can give us an example of each of those so that people understand what the difference is between those two things, those two types of
Sure.
questions.
Sure. I mean, one example is someone comes home and says, I just got in a car accident. And the person's first question should be for the connection, are you okay? But sometimes they're trying to picture what happened. They're trying to understand. So they may say, where were you? Where did this happen? Was the light green? What direction was the car coming from? And the person who's telling the story might be quite shaken up, and they just want to be, held or like be told, it's okay. Do you need to go to the doctor? We have insurance for the car. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. So that would be an example, an extreme example of like, the information. But some people do that, and it's not because they don't care. They would eventually get to, are you okay? And don't worry about it. But first, they start with trying to understand. And for them, they need to gather a lot of information to picture it or to,
Mhm.
really like, get into what's going on. Another example is someone says, how was your day? And the person just says, fine, because it was a perfectly fine day, or they don't want to talk about their day, or else they say, it was stressful or something, but they don't really share anything that their partner now feels like they could connect with. If they said, it was really stressful, my boss is leaving to take another job, and that's making me worried about my own job, like that would be, like they can answer it in a way that would be more helpful for the connection. Now the other person knows, oh, there's something going on that's causing some feelings, and that might have some severe consequences. So let's talk about that more. So if something is just an informational question, it can leave the person who wants the connection feeling unsatisfied. And
Mm.
reciprocally, if someone is looking for information and they're just getting connecting responses, then that doesn't satisfy them either, right? So they're going to keep asking, but what about the details about that thing?
Yeah.
So it is about orienting towards who needs what and how to give both partners enough of what they need, and so that they can each feel satisfied with the communication.
Yeah. And this is it's I love how you're breaking all of this down in a way that's understandable for people. And I think what it also paints a picture of is actually how complex communication is.
Yes.
And that communication is really a tool that we use for connection. And so you must know your audience when you're using communication. So I love that, and how when you were talking about your question, answer, I was like, that's pretty brilliant, because that's challenging it doesn't really matter who you are. Like, it puts you both on an equal ground, and that I can see
Absolutely.
how both types of communicators might be challenged by a
Yes.
question, answer. So
Yes.
it's really lovely. It's a lovely tool. I might have
And
to
when people,
take that.
no problem. When people practice it, it becomes easier. I mean, people will say to me, it didn't feel very authentic. Well, it's not meant to be the way you talk to each other for the rest of your life. And probably even after a couple of weeks, you won't need the exercise anymore, because you'll already start to generalize into regular conversation, where you will ask questions back, where you won't go on too long, where you will say enough to, satisfy your partner. So once those skills are learned and generalized, there's no need for the exercise anymore. But it often does take the exercise, which is hard, to reorient people and to make them aware. Oh God, I used to go on and on and on and on. No wonder my partner would glaze over and not know where to begin. So
Yeah, it's really lovely. And I think that's why skills are so empowering, right? It's, let me teach you how to do this, and then you'll create your own, you'll iterate that skill to make that work
yeah.
for you, to make it work for your partner. And maybe that skill gets iterated differently for your child versus your
Mm-hmm.
partner versus a friend,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and
Yeah.
but it's a great way to start, which is why having a script in the beginning or some rules in the beginning is so lovely. And I think that really is it's really, if we want to be strengths based, having a rule is, I know, very comforting for a lot of my clients, because
Mm-hmm.
it's a framework from which they can function from. And then we can obviously build that out so that it's not so rigid. But to start there is always a lovely spark.
Yeah.
So that's great. That's great.
And
So yeah, go ahead, Grace.
some people want to make it their own from the beginning, where they feel like that back and forth gets them off focus, and they'd rather stick with one person asking one question, get three answers. They ask a second follow-up question, they get three answers. They ask a third follow-up question, they get three answers, and then they reverse roles. And that's fine too. So, back to your original question about rules.
Yeah.
As long as the couple is making up the rules together and both people are feeling good about it, that's the important part.
Yeah, and how cool that you collaborated on something. You collaborated on a
Mm-hmm.
framework that is going to work for both of you, and so that is really attentive, actually. And I do love that about the therapeutic work in general. I mean, I think the session is a scheduled way in which to attend to something that is maybe causing some where they're coming with a little bit of grief or suffering or pain, a pain point that needs some resolution. And so it really becomes, I just love that kind of solution focused idea of, hey, here's let me educate you and provide some education, and then fill that in with some skills, and that you can make your own,
Mm-hmm.
and use, and then that serves them forever.
Right.
So it's so lovely. I love that. Grace, I think sometimes I run into some misconceptions with my work, which is sometimes when I might be helping a client of mine manage their emotions and mood as they might enter, leave high school and enter their next phase of life. And people are like, oh, well, it's like that they don't feel, I mean, they don't really perceive emotions anyway. So, I'm just like, oh my goodness. Or no, they don't want relationships anyway. They just want to be alone. It's like, oh my gosh, that's the very, farthest thing from the truth. And I wonder, as a couples therapist, really having this specific focus, have you run into any kind of misconceptions that are quite harmful, actually, that would be helpful to just squash here?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest one that comes to mind is that it's all on the neurotypical partner to do all the work for the
Mhm.
relationship and that the partner in the spectrum can't. And that's the biggest misconception. And whenever I work with couples, I always say, these tools are for both of you to practice, and both of you will get the benefit of them. There may be specific things that one person is stronger in than the other. So you could set up the division of labor in your household based on successful outcomes, like who's better with money, who's better
Mhm.
with doing the laundry. It doesn't have to be along anyone else's rules except your own. Whether you want to combine money or keep it separate, or combine laundry or keep it separate. Like, you're allowed to have your relationship however you want, but it's much better to have both people feel that they're both doing work. And if one person feels like they're doing all the work, the irony to that is that both partners feel that they are doing all of the work a lot of the times. And I do an exercise with clients sometimes to write it all down for 1 week, all the work you are doing for the relationship. And so when you compare notes, you might find that you're doing work that you think your partner wants, but your partner doesn't even register that that's work because they don't even care about that thing you're doing. And so, yeah, so there's some assumptions that come out. But the other thing that's a huge misconception is that people on the spectrum don't have empathy,
Yeah.
and or that they can't understand something. It might take some effort, like with the duck bunny, right? You see the duck easily, but you might not see the bunny so easily, or vice versa. But if you are trying to see both and you really want to understand, there's lots of different ways that people can help people understand something. But just to write it off as you won't ever understand this, I think is damaging and shaming,
Hmm.
frankly. I mean, there might be something like, let's say someone is a rocket scientist and
Hmm.
they are trying to explain something to their partner about how a rocket works. That partner may never understand it. It's true that some things one person's brain might not be capable of understanding. Um, and something as elusive as like love. Like, how do you understand how one person feels love versus another person feels love? Like, there are some things that are very hard to understand. But to shut it down because they're on the spectrum, or because they're not on the spectrum, or because they're female, or because they're male, or because they're from one culture or another,
Yeah.
that I think is not a very helpful lens. Um, and to just try, let's see where we can get. Some Asperger traits can change and some can't, like
Hmm.
central coherence, right? The
Yep.
ability, whether you see the details or the big picture, that's a hard wiring in your brain. You're not likely to change that orientation of your brain, but you can work with what you know about yourself, and your partner can work with what they know about you. And if you are really good at seeing the details, then let's give that person situations where they're going to shine because they see the details, and you know things like that. So the empathy thing is really a big one. Sometimes what I hear from my couples is that it's not about having the empathy, it's about the communication about the empathy that's lacking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of my clients on the spectrum once told me, I work so hard to understand my partner's feelings. And I said, how would your partner know that? And it was a real aha moment that he realized, oh, he wasn't talking about it at all. He was just in his
Mhm.
own head thinking about what her feelings were. And he was right there with her in his own mind. But she was completely clueless that that's what he was doing. So once he heard that, he started trying to learn to say things like, it sounds like you're feeling whatever. Is that right? And then they could talk about it. And that was a big opening for the relationship.
Yeah. And so reflecting something that was in existence and giving it language,
Mm-hmm.
right? So yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't even aware of that, right? And now that I'm aware of it, now we can call it out. And
Mm-hmm.
I love this idea too that, a strengths-based approach. I mean, that's what you're talking about, Grace, right? It's like,
Right.
what are you naturally inclined, what comes easy for you in this couple, and how do you guys work together as a team through this lens of strength? Whether, I mean, for, whether you're whether you're the couple, the partner that's on the spectrum or not, or both. I'm sure you work with lots of different combinations of couples. But that idea of being strength based, that's not only a concept that is good for couples where a partner might be on the spectrum or not. That's like good
Right.
for couples in general.
Yes, and absolutely. And in fact, all of the tools that I work with neurodiverse couples, they would be great for any couple,
Yeah.
but the opposite isn't true.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that true? And that's why there's an equality to, I think, or what you're doing, which is no matter what the combination is that of the couple, that your approach is going to work for both,
Right.
no matter what their profile is. It's going to
Right.
work for both, and that's why that's effective. And I know before we did this interview, you and I met, and we're really both talking about our love of skills, kind of solution focused skills based empowerment work, because we just see that to be really the most effective tool and mindset in which we bring to our work. So
Yeah.
you and I really hit it off, I will say, in the beginning.
Absolutely.
So Grace, what other, are there any couples listening to this that, apart from AANE, are there any other resources that you could recommend? I know AANE has a plethora. I mean, it's so rich of resources. Anything else that you can think of in regards to resources?
Um, we get asked a lot about how to get diagnosed, how to find a diagnostician.
Mm.
And we have on our website a diagnostician directory where you just put in the name of your state and it hopefully will come up with a list. But sometimes people need low cost or no cost diagnoses. And so I believe GRASP, the organization called GRASP, has those resources for people. I'm actually located in Baltimore, Maryland, and there's a Maryland organization called pathfindersforautism.org that also has some good resources. So yeah.
Yeah. Are you finding that there's adults coming to you that have not been diagnosed
Most of the couples
previous?
that I work with are not formally diagnosed. We have a phrase called spouse diagnosed or self diagnosed, but usually they are coming to me later in life. They're probably in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or even 70s,
Mm.
and they have not been officially diagnosed. And so, but they're fine with just, what they've heard about it or learned about it, feels like it fits. And it helps their partners a great deal because now their partners can really understand that it's not intentional, that their partner in the spectrum actually cares about them. They just had some challenges in how to express that caring. And now they reframe that. So they see the things that their partner does do through a different lens. And so they feel differently cared about than what they originally expected from a relationship. So sometimes the formal diagnosis isn't something a couple needs to do. They're both on board with it. It gives them a language. It gives them, a roadmap for where to go for resources. But sometimes it's a source of contention for a couple. if, let's say, a spouse thinks that their partner's on the spectrum and they're excited and hopeful because now they realize that things were not what they seemed, and they might have seemed quite terrible. Like they might have thought their partner was treating them cruelly, and now they find out that their partner really didn't know how they were coming across. So it's usually quite hopeful for the spouse. But let's say the person that they are married to doesn't like the label or feels like they don't fit in because what they think of when they think of the spectrum is one particular part of it and not the part that they're maybe on. So sometimes the label can be used negatively. That's another rule I might put on that list of rules, not to throw around terminology in a shaming, negative way. Like, just one person always saying, well, you're on the spectrum, well, you're on the spectrum. No one ever says, hey, you just thought of a brilliant idea because you're on the spectrum. They usually say, hey, you can't do this because you're on the spectrum, which I think is, something that people really need to watch how they're putting across the image of being on the spectrum. I do a lot of psychoed with couples. Like, this is neither positive nor negative. These are traits, and even the traits are sometimes positives, and the same traits are sometimes negative.
Yep.
Like perfectionism, right? I mean, you could be a perfectionist and it could drive you to be a super well-achieving career person, but maybe in your personal life it gets in the way, or it prevents you from trying to do things that you're not good at, which you might need to do when you're in a relationship. So anyway, I think that it's really important to for some couples to get the diagnosis, because then there's at least more of a chance of being on the same page with what's going on if they don't start out that way. But even if people are formally diagnosed, I mean, I've had some clients say to me after like 3 years since the formal diagnosis that they're finally just beginning to accept it, because it's such a strange thing, isn't it? You survive decades of your life thinking
Yep.
that you think like everybody else, and then to find out, oh, it's not all of them that think differently, but maybe you're in the minority right now of what's considered to be typical versus diverse in terms of
Yeah.
neurology. So I think it's a hard thing to wrap one's head around. So it takes time, but it's meant, I think, with the couples work, it's really meant to be somewhat of a bridge, and not a fighting area. It's like we don't need to fight over whether or not someone's on the spectrum or not. That's just not helpful, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. And that, I think, the idea of the diagnosis or getting a diagnosis, really, you make that decision if it's going to lead to something more productive. And so how does that work? And I can imagine that understanding that can really help with reducing kind of this idea of like intentionality. Like, I'm not intentionally
Yeah.
trying to be miserable or to make life
Mm-hmm.
miserable, right?
Right.
I just don't see it. I don't see it that way. And so help me understand that, and it's really, I think it's really complicated. And I think couples work, I've always said about couples work, it's 3 people. It's each person plus the couple as its own unit. Like,
Right.
there are 3 people, in a room with a therapist in couples work, which can be, I think, really challenging. But I just love the way in which you simply, in many ways, empower people with tools and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And to try things and then to make it their own, which is, it's so lovely, because those are skills that will last, forever. And then you can work yourself. Hopefully we work ourselves out,
Yes.
of a job, and that's awesome. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Hey, Grace, if you could only choose one skill, I always ask this question, but if you could only choose one skill to empower, let's say, a couple with,
Mm-hmm.
what would it be and why?
It would be the duck bunny, because I think that the perspective taking that you can learn to do goes a long way in a relationship. There has to be room for two different but equally valid perspectives. And I think, it's a paradigm shift for a lot of people. But if you get there, there's so much more collaboration and teamwork that
Yeah.
can happen.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Room for two equally valid perspectives. That's kind of a nice mantra to have, not only in couples work, but even today, I think, to be able to sit with others that we might have a disagreement with, but to know that we have two equally valid perspectives. How do we come
Mm-hmm.
together on this and close that gap and build a
Mm-hmm.
bridge? I love how you said, it's meant to build bridges. And the other, I was like, not a wall or you like, or
Right.
a weapon, or like it's really to build a sense
Yes.
of connection and to bridge. So I love, that's awesome. Grace, if people are hearing this and want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
So you can email me at grace.myhill@aane.org, or you can contact aane.org. There's a way to set up a half an hour phone appointment with me, or to email in questions or looking for resources. We have a lot of resources that I haven't talked about yet. We have groups that we refer to as spouse groups. So they're online Google Forms, or in my private practice, I also have video conference groups for just the non-spectrum partner.
Mm-hmm.
In my private practice, I also have groups for the partner on the spectrum who's trying to learn relationship skills. And AANE has a ton of groups for partners on the spectrum, for either newly diagnosed or in a particular cohort of some sort. Some are social, some are, games nights or trivia, some are more about learning about Asperger's. And there's also a lot of conferences AANE has, and webinars and articles and chances to write and blog for AANE and all kinds of things. They have a ton of resources for parents of kids, teens, and adults on the spectrum. There's a coaching program. It's called Life Map, to work with coaches one-on-one, either around vocational skills or relationship skills, or just daily life skills. There's a program called Life Net, which has to do with when you need more of a support system than maybe your parents are aging, but you're an adult on the spectrum and you want to prepare for a time when you might need a bit of a team approach to just getting through life easier. There's a
Mm-hmm.
grandparents group. There's a group, a very new group now, for people who think that for adults who think that they have a parent on the spectrum. um, there may be, in the future, there may be groups for siblings again. We run them sometimes when there's interest in those. Um, so, it's AANE is very much one-stop shopping for anyone in the family or the community. And also, it's a great place for professionals. We offer a lot of programs to get continuing education units. The program that I direct is for therapists to learn how to work with neurodiverse couples, and we offer a certificate for that training. And then they have access to, they'll be on the website, so neurodiverse couples will find them. So it's a free advertising for them,
Mm-hmm.
ongoing. So there's so many resources there. So back to your question, how people could reach me. You could reach me through AANE. You can reach me through email there as well.
That's awesome. I mean, anyone that goes on the site will see how much you guys are doing.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And I love that you're offering a certification for couples for couples therapists to understand all of these wonderful tools and framework and a way of thinking about how to do couples therapy for this population. And how important it is, because you're right, it works one way, but it doesn't work the other.
Right.
And it's so true. It's so true. Grace, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for spending your time here. If you're interested in finding out more about Grace and AANE, the information is in the description below. And if you got any value from this interview, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Doing so helps to get this information to others just like you. See you in the next video, and thanks for watching.